who have visited us, and I want to thank the people who have supported us. Laura and I are committed to excellence here at the Bush Center. The spirit of the Bush Center is to serve our country and to serve others. We've had a great start. We just want to make sure the next 10 years are as great as the beginning years of what we're doing here.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mrs. Laura Bush.
Thank you all. Thanks, everybody. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you all. Please be seated. Good evening and welcome to the Engage event at the Bush Center. And I want to thank Highland Capital Management for sponsoring tonight's program. Today we opened our new special exhibit, First Ladies, The Style of Influence. I hope you all enjoyed touring this show. I hope you had a chance to tour the show, and I hope you'll come back again and again. I thought before we get started, you might want to report on some of my family members. My father and mother-in-law, President George H.W. Bush and Barbara, are doing very well. You may have heard that they were both in the hospital this time last year, and then just a few days later, they were tossing the coin at the Super Bowl in Houston. President Bush at age 93 and Barr at 92 are both happy and in good spirits. George and I believe they're showing us the way to age with grace. In Maine, my mother-in-law, Barbara, walked her dogs on the beach every day. Then, summer before last, she walked with a walker. And now she can't walk on the beach. So she wildly drives her golf cart around Walker's Point with the little dogs running along behind her for exercise. George and I have learned from both of them that all we know we have is now. So take advantage of your life as it is and walk on the beach every chance you get. My George has been working on his golf game and his painting. He's painted portraits of 98 wounded warriors that he met through the Bush Institute's Warrior Open golf tournament and the W100K bike ride that we hosted at our ranch. The portraits were here on display. I hope you all saw them last year, and now the show is on the road. It's in Midland right now, and we'll head to Springfield, Missouri next. I was in Midland last week visiting my mother, and so I ran over to the Museum of the Southwest to see the portraits there. The portraits, along with the stories he's written about the warriors, have been published in his book, Portraits of Courage, and I hope you all have a copy of it. But of course, the best thing that's happened to us is that we've become grandparents. George and I are the proud grandparents to our darling granddaughters, Mila, who's 4, and 2-year-old Poppy Louise. Mila and Poppy are perfect. And our daughter Jenna and our son-in-law Henry are thrilled, although they have to be careful of being trampled by George and me in our rush to get our hands on the babies. Jenna and her husband Henry Hager are enjoying life with their babies. Jenna's working as a contributing correspondent for NBC's Today Show. You may have seen her. George says she's just continuing the Bush family tradition of warm relations with the media. Too bad that has to be a joke. Our daughter Barbara has founded a nonprofit called Global Health Corps that places recent college graduates in the health field in underserved areas. Her Global Health Corps fellows are at work in 4 cities in the United States and 4 countries in Africa. You can learn more about Global Health Corps if you're interested, or if you know a young person who might be interested in becoming a fellow by looking on the web at ghcorps.org. George and I are proud of the work our girls are doing, and we're happy to be back home in Texas living what I call the afterlife. In the state, George calls the promised land. George is busy with the public policy programming here at the Bush Institute, and as for me, it's come to this. This is the Laura Bush bobblehead doll. I got this from a friend of mine who found it in the gift shop of the Constitutional Center in Philadelphia a few weeks after President Obama's election. It was on the clearance shelf. He said he couldn't resist sending it to me. I told him he could have tried a little harder. But I'm kind of glad I have it. When you live in the White House, when you're a bobblehead inside a bubble, reality can get a little warped. Sometimes you have to work hard just to recognize yourself. During those 8 years, I tried to make it a general policy not to read the absurd news items about our family, but sometimes it was just too much fun. All this may be old news to those of you who've occasionally taken a peek at the reading material in the grocery store checkout line. But I was very surprised to learn that my marriage had gone so far south that I'd moved out of the White House. Though things between George and me must have improved because he was soon buying me a $16 million mansion. And no doubt it was Allie Beth that sold it to me. There were other revelations. My daughters had this funny habit of getting engaged to people I'd never heard of. Maybe this was because they were unhinged by the knowledge that the first President Bush, who in their naivete they lovingly referred to as Gampy, was in reality a space alien. When we moved to Washington, we moved into a house that we already knew very well. As you may recall, space alien Gampy was elected president in 1988, and so for 4 years the White House had been the home of my in-laws. And I knew from the example my mother-in-law had set as First Lady that it really is a home, a place where an awesome looming history could exist side by side with the chaos of normal family life. When we moved to Washington, George's focus was on the issues that he'd stressed during his campaign: education reform, tax cuts, Medicare, and prescription drugs. My first job was to find my identity as First Lady. Not as easy a task as you might think, since everyone seemed eager just to assign me the personality of a previous First Lady. Who do you want to be? Reporters kept asking. Hillary Clinton or Barbara Bush? My answer was always the same. I think I'll just be Laura Bush. I knew Laura Bush pretty well, having grown up as her in Midland, Texas. But there always seemed to be people who claimed to know me better. One identity that was assigned to me was that of a stereotypical 1950s housewife, someone who was comfortable being pleasant and dutiful and keeping her opinions to herself. This is, I suppose, the kind of caricature that takes shape when you're a person who doesn't think it necessary to say everything you feel or tell everything you know. But I did have a few opinions I was very happy to share. I believe that women are catalysts for positive change. I believe that every child deserves a quality education and a safe and healthy childhood. And I believe that literacy is an essential foundation for democracy. After the events of September 11th, the things that I did as First Lady, I was no longer just speaking out about literacy. I was giving a radio address denouncing the brutal treatment of women and children by the Taliban. I was no longer just organizing book festivals. I was visiting with a class of courageous women police officers in Afghanistan's Bamiyan province, the same province where the Taliban had shocked the world by destroying those two towering 6th century Buddhas. So as I found my way as First Lady, advocating global literacy and health, traveling to schools and visiting with America's young people, I was also a wife and mother. And that's what we hope this new exhibit will help people understand, that the role of the First Lady is vast and undefined. The First Lady doesn't just wear beautiful gowns and plan lavish state dinners. She's a national hostess, welcoming other First Ladies and world leaders to our country. She's a teammate, supporting the work of her husband. She's a champion, working on issues and causes that are important to her. And she's a policy advocate, advancing and encouraging government and private sector action in important issues. First Ladies aren't elected, but they're given the remarkable opportunity to help address problems in our country and around the world, to use their influence and platform to make a lasting impact. After reading about the First Ladies that are included in this exhibit, I think you'll see that this is what each of them have done. Now I'd like to introduce the Deputy Director of the Bush Institute's Women's Initiative, Natalie Ganella-Platts. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Bush. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mrs. Bush, and thank you to everyone here tonight who's joined us as we launch our new exhibit, First Ladies' Style of Influence. If you're here tonight, you know we have some pretty incredible programming here at the Bush Institute. And while it's not polite to brag, I have to say I think I have one of the coolest jobs here. And that's because I not only get to work in support of First Ladies, but the work that we do here complements the incredible efforts they're doing to empower women and girls in their countries and across the globe. And part of that was leading the development and research of a first-of-its-kind analysis on the influence and leadership of global First Ladies. Our report, A Role Without a Rulebook, includes interviews and profiles with 14 current and former First Ladies from 5 continents. Remarkable women like Mrs. Bush, Mrs. Monica Gangos, the First Lady of Namibia, Mrs. Rula Ghani, the First Lady of Afghanistan. And I have to say one of my favorite moments from this project was St. Patrick's Day 2016, when I had the incredible honor of interviewing Mrs. Barbara Bush, who couldn't have been more gracious, and using her incredible humor, she also reminded me that I forgot to wear green that day, something I also will not forget. But it was remarkable because we really have looked at how these women have made a difference. So really, what did we find out? Well, there are 4 key things I want to touch on before we get to tonight's panel. The first is the idea this is a role without a rule book. There is no job description, but there's a lot of ambiguity. And we have the women who filled this role throughout the history of our country to thank for what it means today. Their personalities, their professional backgrounds, the issues they care about. That is what has defined this role. The second thing, and it goes back to what Mrs. Bush mentioned in her opening remarks, this 4-part typology, 4 key functions that all First Ladies in this country and across the globe employ: hostess, teammate, champion, and policy advocate. And that's what we're going to talk about tonight more deeply with the panel. The third thing, and this is really important, and I'm really glad I have the opportunity to talk about this, First Ladies face remarkable challenges, things like gender stereotypes. We don't yet have a first gentleman in this country, but there are international examples, and you will see we treat men and women very differently. You're an educated audience, but I would bet most of you would have difficulty naming a current first gentleman. And I'm sure you have yet to see a headline about their suit choices or their preference of Oxfords over Brogues. The fourth thing I want to mention, and keeping in mind those challenges and keeping in mind the ambiguity, First Ladies push forward, and they do so in ways that have incredible impact. And I have to say, that is really what this report is about. That is what our exhibit is about, and that is what tonight's panel will be about. It's been important for the work we do here to support First Ladies. For instance, what we're doing in Namibia right now in support of Monica Gangos' work on youth empowerment. It's also important because there's a gap in research on global First Ladies and on women's leadership more broadly. So at a time when women's leadership is finally getting the recognition it deserves, on the first day of Women's History Month and a week before International Women's Day, I can't think of a better way to celebrate than acknowledging the contributions and accomplishments of this remarkable sorority of women who've really shaped our country and the world for the better. So with that, please join me in welcoming our esteemed panel to the stage. Fantastic. Well, I am absolutely ecstatic to be sitting with fellow First Lady fanatics, fellow First Lady advocates, and tonight, as we remember the ladies, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Katie Sibley, author and director of the American Studies program at St. Joseph's University, Anita McBride, executive in residence at the Center for Congressional and Presidential Studies at American University, where she directs their First Ladies Initiative, and she also happens to be the former Chief of Staff to Mrs. Laura Bush.
Best job.
Bill Allman, former curator of the White House, who has really an incredible career, and I'm so excited he's with us tonight. And Lea Berman, author and former White House social secretary, who also served the George W. Bush administration. So getting to the four functions, I really think we need to start with this idea of hostess. It's the most recognizable role of First Ladies, and it really dates back to the birth of our country, and is rooted in the effective application of soft power and cooperative influence, or the effective use of interpersonal skills. Lea, from your view as a former social secretary and the author of Treating People Well, why is this important, and how has this idea evolved over time?
Well, Laura Bush once said, the role of a First Lady is whatever the First Lady wants it to be. And I think that that's, first of all, a wonderful job description, but secondly, a great jumping off point for this conversation, because traditionally the role of the First Lady could only be a hostess because of the circumscribed gender roles. But going back to the times even of Washington, Martha Washington was a very adept hostess who made sure that there were regular events, a Friday evening levee for supporters and friends of President Washington to give them an opportunity to be together, get to know each other, form relationships that might help them in the process of governing later on during the day. And this is something that has always been the purview of the First Lady. And some of them, frankly, are better at it than others. When you have a First Lady who likes people and someone who has great interpersonal skills themselves. For example, Dolly Madison was a very effective hostess because she just was a very social person who enjoyed it, and she helped her husband enormously by doing that. Eleanor Roosevelt was not someone who was personally comfortable with people in the same way, but she was equally effective using her role of hostess as First Lady in achieving wonderful things, not only in support of her husband in the war effort and the various programs that they were very involved in during the Depression, but in putting forth her own issues. And I will leave the other panelists to talk about the policy issues, but just for now, I would say that as the First Lady's role has evolved and gender roles have changed, she now has the opportunity, and hopefully someday he now has the opportunity to do many more things than be a hostess, but that's not to denigrate the power of a really tremendous hostess. It's a soft form of power. It is an ability to influence by impressing people, by drawing them in as friends. And I will tell you, I could tell you so many stories like this, but having a First Lady who has tremendous interpersonal skills and is very thoughtful and detailed and thinks about all of the aspects of being a hostess made my job as a social secretary much easier. And I remember on one occasion we were having a reception and a lecture in honor of President's Day, and we'd invited a Lincoln scholar to come and speak at the White House. And as the event began, which was really intended for about 150 people who were mostly historians, many of them Civil War historians, many of them Lincoln historians. I was called aside by Mrs. Bush, and she said, could you please arrange for everyone to be able to go up and see the Lincoln bedroom when the lecture is over? So we worked that out, and this is not something people see on the White House tour because it's on the family floor. And so guests started to go up, and I noticed the line wasn't really moving. And after 10 or 15 minutes, I ran upstairs to check to make sure everything was fine. And I wish you could see what I saw that day. People were standing awestruck, the way you would stand at the altar of a great cathedral, just looking around at everything, at the bed, at the Emancipation Proclamation that was there on the table. And they were so moved. And Laura Bush understood that this was going to be deeply meaningful to people who had spent their whole lives studying Lincoln and studying the war. And it had such a profound impact on these people. And they came to me afterward and were so effusive in their thanks. And they wrote letters. And what she did was not just impress on them the Lincoln experience, but she probably changed whatever their views may have been before about Laura Bush, George Bush, the war in Iraq. All of a sudden, it was humanized, and it made an enormous difference. And I've seen that happen many, many times in my job as social secretary. And just to digress for a moment, the job of the social secretary is to execute the functions of the president and first lady at the White House. And the first social secretary was hired by Edith Roosevelt, who really needed someone to do correspondence and more specifically to let people know in the nicest possible way that she couldn't come to whatever event she was being invited to. Because first ladies can never accept all the invitations that they receive. And so this was a tactful way of telling people in a positive manner that as much as they appreciated the invitations, they couldn't attend, and it wasn't coming directly from Mrs. Roosevelt. So over the years, the role of social secretary has really evolved. Now it's much more political, it's far more technical. Social secretaries need to know the friends and supporters of the president and first lady, but the job is still essentially the same in that a social secretary tries to make sure that every event at the White House reflects the entertaining style of the president, first lady, and furthers the policies of the administration. So I would now defer to you to go back to that, but that is the basis of the hostess value, and it is very powerful, and it has a real influence building capability.
It's very much, we judge this book by its cover too often, and we look at the surface, but there's a lot of substance behind it. And that's a great segue to Anita. You witnessed up close the influence of soft power, interpersonal skills, and the connection to policy. Sure. How have First Ladies leveraged this connection, and why are these linkages important between the East Wing and the West Wing?
It's a great question. Thank you, Natalie. And Laura Bush, I want to talk about, obviously I've had the opportunity to be in a few White Houses and seen a number of First Ladies and their work. But for Laura Bush, as a champion and advocate for so many of the Bush administration policies and initiatives that were so central to the war on terror and to development in the Middle East, and as development around the world. For example, we know she was an advocate for women in Afghanistan. We know she spoke for human rights in Burma. And again, these were all presidential initiatives where she could add her voice and be an advocate. For when the president made the decision to re-enter UNESCO in 2003 after many years, almost a 20-year hiatus. And this, again, was directly linked to efforts in the war on terror. And by re-entering UNESCO, the Director General asked her if she would be interested in being the honorary ambassador for the Decade of Literacy. And what Mrs. Bush did, and typical with things with the UN, it took, there were a period of time where it really languished until Laura Bush took up the mantle to really show leadership on this and develop a series of important conferences, these global literacy conferences where we brought in the best experts in literacy and education around the world to really delve into what the best practices are to improve literacy and education outcomes. And not only a single conference or a one-off, but this series of global literacy conferences where one of the most important things that she did was work with her counterparts to champion these conferences in their region, again, so that they could be the agents of change for their countries. It was really very powerful. And the other aspect, in addition to PEPFAR in Afghanistan, that we can have a whole session on that, but was in the Middle East. And one of the things that President Bush had wanted to do again after 9/11 was really put a great deal of emphasis on changing the nature of our relationship with people in the Middle East. And he directed the State Department to really put an enormous amount of resources into public diplomacy initiatives, and the program, which still exists at the State Department, called the Middle East Partnership Initiative, or MEPI. And one of the things that Laura Bush did, which was really very groundbreaking, was to go into the Middle East, closed societies like Saudi Arabia, and take a health diplomacy message there. And this was on breast cancer. And where, you know, in the stigma around breast cancer in the Middle East, obviously quite high, the way that it was in our country just 30 or plus years ago. And Mrs. Bush used that example of the leadership and courage of other first ladies in our country, Betty Ford, Nancy Reagan, who went public with their breast cancer to help chip away at this stigma. And I have to say, I have many powerful experiences and memories of traveling with Laura Bush to 67 of the 77 countries that she went to. But one of the most powerful and enduring memories for me was sitting in a room in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, with women who had been victims of breast cancer, and were the name of the event, if you can call it an event, but the conversation was really labeled as a breaking the silence conversation. And these women were very open with the experiences that they had had of their husbands leaving them, or their sons. You know, the one woman that told you how her son shaved his head in solidarity with his mother after she had lost her hair with treatment. I mean, these were such powerful examples, but these women, you know, felt that they could talk to Laura Bush. And not only that, but what I got a email from a Saudi Arabian female physician who had been part of that breaking the silence conversation. She'd been a victim of breast cancer herself, but a year or two after that trip, she had said after Laura Bush's visit that the percentage of women that were seeking diagnosis and treatment went up by almost 30%, which was really an incredible, again, sort of chipping away at the stigma of breast cancer. So in so many ways, I mean, she really connected the East and West Wing initiatives, and really was a champion for the president, who really could not do as much as the travel that Laura Bush did. I mean, 15 countries in Africa on 5 trips, 3 times to Afghanistan, 3 times to the Middle East, Central America, I mean, just everywhere, as the greatest advocate and voice that the president could rely on to bring the generosity of the American people around the world.
And that idea of building human connections translates in other examples as well. And I believe we have an audio clip from Barbara Bush's very famous speech from Wellesley College, which I'd like to talk a little bit on as well. So if we could play that.
The third choice that must not be missed is to cherish your human connections, your relationships with family and friends. For several years, you've had impressed upon you the importance to your career of dedication and hard work, and of course that's true. But as important as your obligations as a doctor, a lawyer, a business leader will be, you are a human being first. And those human connections with spouses, with children, with friends are the most important investment you will ever make.
And that was really important because she invited Raisa Gorbachev to join her. And if you could just briefly share a little bit about the significance of that and those human connections.
Well, I think one of the important things to remember about this commencement speech at Wellesley, too, is that these graduates did not want Barbara Bush to be their speaker. And there was a backlash against her. But in her characteristic use of humor, like she did with you on St. Patrick's Day, to make her point, you were in the wrong
I
color.
will never forget to wear green again.
She, one of the first things she said at the podium was, I know you were expecting Alice Walker, who was known for writing, The Color Purple. Instead, you got someone who's known for the color of her hair. And it helped to just sort of dial back a little bit of the tension that was there. But you mentioned Raisa Gorbachev that she read, which was a very astute thing for Mrs. Bush to do, too, for a variety of reasons. But one, this was now a new personalities on the stage in the Soviet Union. It had not fully been the Soviet Union had not completely changed, I think, to a democracy yet at that point. But General Secretary Gorbachev and Mrs. Gorbachev came, and there was this fascination with Mrs. Gorbachev, and the President Bush was hosting them. Of course, at the White House, this was an important step in the relationship between our two countries. And Mrs. Bush brought Raisa Gorbachev to Wellesley with her. And it was that she had the confidence to do that and to show her an American university campus, because remember, Mrs. Gorbachev was a college professor. So this was an important part of the foreign policy aspect, the diplomatic aspect of building a relationship between these two women that then also extended to the relationship between the two leaders.
And building on that a bit more, we can't speak to the role of hostess or teammate without talking about pop culture. And so often we label certain first ladies as inactive, but we forget that influence happens in more subtle ways, and pop culture is a great representation of that. Mamie Eisenhower comes to mind.
Yes, indeed she does. And how many of you, perhaps, have a pink bathroom? Did they spread to Texas, possibly?
My parents did.
I have one. I'm very proud of it. We had a renovation a few years ago. I said, we're not getting rid of that bathroom. Nope. So this was Mamie's favorite color, pink. You may know this. She also liked green, and she had to move a lot because, of course, she was an Army wife, right? So every time they moved, one of the ways she tried to feel at home was to, change the color scheme to what she liked, which was pink, and some green maybe for him. I think he had a greener bathroom maybe. But there was this sense, and what's really interesting is as she becomes First Lady, this has an even bigger impact, right? Because now the whole country learns about this pink and what is this about? And we begin to see pink shirts. The Brooks Brothers begins to have pink shirts. They hadn't even for men, And there was also much interest in, indeed, the bathroom changing that you all know about, these shifts there, but also in her garments and what she wore, which isn't always pink, although it was her favorite color. But she had this way of wearing Christian Dior outfits that the kind of, I don't know if they were so flattering, to tell you the truth, but they had this sort of flowery aspect. The skirt kind of flared out like a petal, and I think she kind of liked that. And she, she was a grandmother, but she didn't want people to think of her as whatever that means, being a grandmother, just fine. I think I'm old enough to be a grandmother. I'm not one yet, but, that's not bad. But she nevertheless said, no, I have style. I guess she didn't think grandmothers did. And she also cut her bangs. Do you remember her bangs? She had these very short bangs. And that became popular, even though they do look a little odd, don't they? And so she had the bangs, and she had the pink, and she had the dresses, and she also had the charm bracelets, right? Remember, this was something too. And what I'm saying about all this is not just because it's maybe kind of fun, but she had an influence, right? Her dresses, her bangles, people liked them. People wanted to emulate her. They wanted to have this because she was using the greatest platform, as we heard, earlier from Laura Bush. I mean, being the First Lady is an amazing platform for many, many important causes, but also for fashion. And it does tend to influence, I think, the rest of the country to kind of try some of these things out. And it's interesting. We often remember this, for instance, with Jackie Kennedy, but we don't always think, do we, of Mamie Eisenhower, or for that matter, of Florence Harding, who also set quite a fashion. She had the habit of wearing these chokers, which people also wanted to emulate, although they may not have wanted to emulate them for the reasons that she wore them, which is that sadly she had a kidney ailment. And you were talking earlier about disease. I mean, she was the first lady really to come out about her illness. Other first ladies and presidents, of course, have been much more quiet about that, not wanted the American public to know. I mean, Mrs. McKinley, for instance, her husband kind of just pushed her away, and poor Mrs. Taft, she couldn't speak after a stroke, and she was kind of silenced literally, but also off the stage, right? But Florence wanted people to know, and she wanted people to pray for her. She was sick, and she wore the choker because it kind of covered some of the strands, I guess, in her neck from her kidney ailment. I'm not quite sure what that all was about, but she definitely didn't want it seen. So that became a fashion, though. People thought, oh, and there was Harding blue as well. She wasn't into pink, but she was into blue, and people like that. So there were other first ladies, maybe like Lou Hoover and Eleanor Roosevelt. Their fashion didn't kind of catch on, but
You could see it in the exhibit.
You never know. It could come back. It could come back. But on that point of design, I mean, we can't talk about first ladies without speaking to their mark on the White House. And Bill, you're really the perfect person to kind of cover this topic for us. So why has the role of the First Lady been so critical and central to the history of the White House? And how, or who are the women that really stand out in this regard?
Well, the White House consists of public rooms and private rooms. And not everybody understands that the private rooms are really the family's quarters, and they can do what they want with them within financial limitations. And the public rooms were meant to be a stage, a place for great entertaining and hostessing and political activities. And so in the 19th century, they gave you money from the government to keep the public rooms up. And if you didn't have enough money to do what you hoped to accomplish, they said, well, then have a garage sale and get rid of the old stuff that you don't like any longer. And so things got away, unfortunately. In the 20th century, things were a little bit more stable. But one of the great accomplishments that I had the good fortune to work on with First Lady Laura Bush was the Lincoln bedroom on the second floor. I mean, it's a very famous space. Everybody hears about the Lincoln bedroom. And it is strictly a private quarter space. It's treated as somewhat of a state room on the second floor, but it is in the private quarters. And so since 1964, there has been an organization called the Committee for the Preservation of the White House, to which the president, and with First Lady's input, I'm sure, appoints public members to help advise on the maintenance of the museum character of the public rooms. And so many First Ladies have been extremely active in it. Mrs. Bush was a great honorary chairperson, which is the role that's assigned to the First Lady for this committee. But when we got to the Lincoln bedroom, she said, well, you know, here it is. You see the picture of how it looked in the early 1990s there. I mean, it's got important Lincoln-era furniture in it. The walls are painted yellow. The carpet, which is remotely period style, had been on the floor since 1952. So it, you know, by the time it was up, it had 50 years of use in not a high-traveled space. But so Mrs. Bush said, I'd really like to improve this room, and we have this great committee. Can we go to this committee and say, you don't have purview for this private space, but you're so smart and talented and experienced. Can we draw on these abilities to create a better Lincoln bedroom? So the idea is that this room had been Lincoln's office. So it has when there was no West Wing, the offices were in the private quarters. And so it has a historical perspective as an office. But what has survived is mostly a suite of bedroom furniture that was used down the hall and has been in this room since President Truman put it there in 1945. So the idea is we would mix two trends. We would look at all the historical records we could find and try to create a room that used the historical data to create a more accurate period-style room. So we studied drawings of the room in the Lincoln administration. They're just a couple. We studied bills and descriptors, newspaper articles that talked about the bedroom furniture and the things that were associated with it. And so with a lot of work and sponsorship from the White House Historical Association, we evolved a much more high-style how the Victorian era would have known the Lincoln bedroom, with the same bed, it's the one that was in the previous picture, but with the, a copy of the long-lost original crown that held the bed hangings, matching cornices over the draperies, carpet based on the office carpet, wallpaper based on the office wallpaper, and so it turned into what we thought was a pretty spectacular and in many respects, the most historically accurate room in the house. Because the public rooms are full of great things, but it's not like we looked back at any one moment in time like you would at, let's say, Monticello or Mount Vernon and create a perfect period microcosm, because we're celebrating the whole of presidential history and the whole of First Lady involvement in the House. And so it was a wonderful opportunity, and it was a great moment for us to work with Mrs. Bush as the instigator and the motivator and the enormous cheerleader, as well as a great person to look at things and say, oh, I think that's good, or not, as the case might be.
Fantastic. Beautiful. And we can't talk about the White House and the influence of First Ladies without mentioning Lou Hoover and what she did with regard to the registry, and really, setting a new trajectory for this idea of preservation. Obviously, Jacqueline Kennedy was hugely instrumental in that, but I was wondering if you could share a bit and why what Lou Hoover did was so important.
Well, many of the things you saw in that picture, the bed, the center table, some of the chairs, chest of drawers, were Lincoln-era pieces in the house. And when Mrs. Hoover came into the White House in 1929, she recruited a friend, and she said, I'd really like to do a study of what has survived in the house. And we'll talk to the servants, we'll see who's been here the longest and can pass judgment on, I know that's been there since the Arthur administration, or that kind of influence. And so in some cases, they got the information right, in some cases they didn't. But they wrote an enormous volume, typed up, telling about the history of the rooms, the history of the objects. It was the first time objects were given an identifiable number. Little diamond tags were nailed onto the undersides of the furniture, and they became the basis in the Kennedy administration for what we call the old collection. The things that were in the house when Mrs. Kennedy arrived that had always been there since they were new, as opposed to what was then collected since Mrs. Kennedy's time, which we call the new collection, even though in large part they're older things. That, they were antique things that came in for their beauty, not necessarily for their historical nature. So it became the whole foundation for the numbering system and the cataloging system that the Curator's Office has pursued ever since in handling both longtime historic and more recently interesting objects added to the rooms for the general nature of for the public to enjoy.
Incredible. And I have to say, Lou Hoover, I feel, doesn't always get the credit she deserves, and we have some incredible artifacts next door, so if you get to the exhibit, you also have to check out her video camera. So I feel like she would have been first in line at the Apple store for the new iPhone if she lived in today's world, because she was really into new technology as well. She was very perceptive. And so you actually can go on the National Archives and see some of her home videos as well. So just a remarkable woman, and I'm really glad we were able to speak to her impact tonight. But moving on with this idea of the stewardship of the White House, the preservation of the White House, there's connections back to interpersonal skills as well, and this idea of inclusivity. How have First Ladies leveraged the White House and the importance that it projects to really feel, to have other groups feel included and to create a sense of welcome and warmth?
Well, I think First Ladies are always thinking about how to bring people into the White House who've never been there before. It's very natural to invite your friends, and you invite them the next Christmas, and you invite them to dinners, and that's wonderful, and that's what they should do, and with their supporters as well. But there is this concept that by being more inclusive, you're drawing more people within the orbit of the administration. You're giving them the opportunity to see, and particularly when you're dealing with Republicans and a Republican administration at war, that we were not people with two heads, we were not evil or demons, and to let us show them that we were all hardworking people who wanted the best for our country just as they did, we might have had a different way of wanting to go about it. And so Laura Bush was very good at thinking of ways to bring people into the White House who'd never been there before. And one year she had the idea for Veterans Day, which was an annual reception that we had, to invite all of the World War II vets who had served in her father's battalion. So these gentlemen were largely in their 80s by then, and we had some help from the Veteran Administration to locate them, and they're mostly living in quiet lives all around the country, and we started calling to invite them, and we had to call a number of them multiple times because they didn't really believe we were calling from the White House. And one person called the Better Business Bureau on us in Arizona. And then they had to be persuaded to come, and they'd say, well, I can't travel alone that far. And we'd say, well, bring your family. It's okay, you can bring your family. And then they'd say, well, I don't have a jacket and I don't have a tie. And we'd say, we don't care, just come. And you see the photo from this event. It was the happiest group of people I've ever seen at the White House. So sweet. And my best memory of the White House is always seeing people come in for the first time, because they walk onto the state floor and they look around and they recognize that they have this common heritage with every family who's lived in that house. And you can see people become very emotional about it. They feel very proud, they feel patriotic, and it's just a wonderful thing to see people recognizing that. So when First Ladies bring people in who've never been there before, who maybe have felt disenfranchised for a very long time, it has a very powerful, influential effect.
And looking more fully at the concept of teammate, which I think is overlooked at times, what warrants our attention and why? And there's a few examples I'd love to speak to, starting with Florence Harding.
Oh, I'm so glad. I think it's your favorite.
we couldn't have you here and not talk about Florence Harding more fully.
But it's a wonderful, actually, a segue from what you were speaking about, Lee, because she also opened up the White House. After the Wilson administration, you may know that President Wilson was incapacitated the last year and a half of his presidency. The White House was closed off. There were sheep grazing on the grounds. Partly that was a war measure, but they didn't seem to go away. And Florence wanted to bring people onto the White House grounds. She wanted them to come. She wanted them to come to the White House. She wanted to shake their hand. And in fact, in the end, her hand kind of fell off. She shook so many hands. I mean, I'm not kidding you. She was very welcoming. But this is where she's a teammate as well, because she did this with her husband to help him. They stood together. They shook hands together. The White House was their house, and they were kind of a folksy pair. And also, of course, speaking of these veterans, oh, here's a wonderful picture, actually. I'll get to that in a minute. But just to pick up on the piece with the veterans, because this is very important. It was a big cause in World War I as well. They were coming in right after that. And so she welcomed the veterans to the White House, some of them very ill, infirm, had lost eyes, limbs. She let them touch her face. She invited them in. And this was, of course, being a teammate with her husband, who wanted as well, to set up a Veterans Bureau to help these people. Unfortunately, it was run by kind of a crook, and that was discovered very quickly. And the Hardings actually went after a crook in their administration. Yes, they did. They didn't just, let scandals happen, as they are often reputed to do. So she actually was one of the ones who was responsible for kind of ferreting that out about Mr. Forbes and the Veterans Administration, making sure he was out of the way. But this picture here also shows her very important role as a kind of a person who knew the power of a photo op and how that would help the White House and how that would help the presidential administration. Remember, this is the 1920s. There are movies. There is Hollywood. She was inviting Hollywood stars to the White House. All kinds of famous people. Lillian Gish and others came to the White House. Al Jolson. They, in fact, were involved in the campaign. This was a time when Hollywood liked Republicans. Isn't that interesting? So here she has this group of women who came from the Philippines. Their husbands were seeking independence. They were as well, but the husbands, of course, being taken more seriously on that issue. They were brought in for a photo op, but you can see here that the way the movie men are lined up taking pictures, and Florence is right in the middle of it. She knows, right? This is going to make her look good, these lovely women, and they were really smart and interesting women too, these women from the Philippines, and they were activists, just like she was. So she took this role as an activist in a lot of ways for veterans, for animal rights, and also to make herself and her husband more visible in the White House, to do more. And I know we may come back to activism, so I'll turn it back to Natalie in case she wants to pick up some other threads in the meanwhile.
Well, I love, I've seen many of your lectures, your book, but you also mentioned how Florence really set the cracks that Yes. I mean, we talk about Eleanor Roosevelt breaking the mold of the First Lady identity. And Florence Harding kind of set the cracks to allow Eleanor Roosevelt to do that. Yes. And in thinking about this idea of teammate and segueing into champion, you know, Eleanor Roosevelt comes to mind, and being that she was First Lady during one of the tumultuous times in human history, you know, we really saw her step into this idea of teammate and champion as well.
Well, one of the, you know, things about Eleanor Roosevelt that I think most people don't know is, you know, her voice was the first voice that Americans heard on the night of December 7th, 1941. It was Sunday night. It was her regular radio broadcast that she did every week. And she used that opportunity because the president delivered his, you know, Day of Infamy speech the next day, December 8th in Congress. So hers was really this first voice, and she was galvanizing the country, particularly young people and women. I think we have a little bit of a clip. I don't know if we're going to play it.
Yes, we do have an audio clip.
Do we want to play that now?
Yeah, we can play the audio clip now just to give folks a sense of the magnitude of it.
Whatever is asked of us, I'm sure we can accomplish it. We are the free and unconquerable people of the United States of America. To the young people of the nation, I will speak a word tonight. You are going to have a great opportunity. There will be high moments in which your strength and your ability will be tested. I have faith in you. I feel as though I was standing upon a rock. And that rock is my faith in my fellow citizens. Now we will go back to the program which we had arranged for tonight.
Well, you can see here the nation is in shock, and she's right away standing up to say it is important that we all come together to defend our freedom, defend our democracy, and again, appealing to youth, appealing to women to get involved in the war effort. And remember, she had 4 sons. All 4 sons were in theater of war. So, and she also, you know, did something that her husband wanted her to do, because Eleanor Roosevelt had reservations about Winston Churchill. And Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill obviously became great partners in the war. But he sent Eleanor Roosevelt, encouraged her to go to Great Britain in 1942 and to meet with her counterpart as well, Clementine Churchill. And President Roosevelt had said to Winston Churchill, this will be important for our better halves, that they will get along famously. And I think knowing that it would help the relationship overall between all 4 of them during this critical, you know, time in the country. Mrs. Roosevelt also did, and we all know she was the eyes and ears of her husband around the country. She traveled for him, seeing the works projects, administration efforts, and going overseas to see our troops. But one of the things that she did too was encourage Americans to write to the president and to write to her, and really developed the formal White House presidential correspondence system that to a degree still exists today. In fact, my first job in the White House was as a mail analyst for Ronald Reagan. And if you can imagine, you had to be trained how to read the mail and how to code it. And the woman who trained me to do it was hired by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. She was still there. This was 1983. She was hired in 1943 and was still there, teaching us how to read mail.
Incredible. And Eleanor Roosevelt is well represented in the new exhibit. And I have to say, in our report as well, we look at just the incredible relationship between Clementine Churchill and Eleanor Roosevelt. It's a fantastic example of the value of First Ladies connecting together at important times in history.
One thing I did say that was very funny, that actually President Roosevelt sent some gifts with Mrs. Roosevelt to London, and one of them was something that Mrs. Churchill absolutely loved, and that was a Virginia ham.
Oh my God. Well, you know what they say about...
Imagine when there were rations and everything going on. That was a real
British
treasure.
Food in and of itself,
Absolutely. But Mrs. Roosevelt, let me just say one last thing, really came away seeing the incredible spirit of the British people and of the women who really were facing incredible struggles at the time, of course.
And that is a fantastic segue into speaking to the value of champions and policy advocate. And they sit quite closely together, so I like to talk about them sort of in the same thread. But first I want to give some nods to the women of the early 20th century who really, like Florence Harding, set the trajectory for champions and policy advocates. And then we also need to talk a bit about Jacqueline Kennedy, and to round it out, obviously, with the example of Mrs. Bush.
Of course.
Well, in the early 20th century, even before Florence, I do go back before Florence, yes, there was Nellie Taft. Have you heard of Nellie Taft? I mentioned her briefly as having a stroke. It was so sad, 2 months into her husband's administration, and she was the one who wanted him to be president more than he did, really. I mean, this is pretty well known. So anyway, she didn't get to enjoy that for too long because she was kind of incapacitated after that. But before that, she had spoken up on behalf of workers, women workers in these rather difficult straits, for instance, in industry, where they were regularly beaten up. If you followed the story of what happened to some of those young women working in places like New York's textile industry, she went down to North Carolina there and also visited some of the children that were working in some of the factories. But she was particularly concerned about the women working in Washington in those new bureaucracies, very dim, hardly any bathrooms. Now, we often associate this, I think, with Mrs. Wilson, the first Mrs. Wilson, Ellen Wilson, but actually it was Nellie Taft who first noted this and brought it to people's attention, very interestingly. Now, she did, suffer the stroke, and so she was succeeded. Of course, the next president was Woodrow Wilson, and his wife, Ellen, sorry, not Eleanor, she was the other activist, but Ellen Wilson was also a very interesting woman. And sadly, she too was felled literally just over a year into her administration. She had a kidney ailment, and she died in 1914, sorry, barely a year. But she saw the problem of African Americans living in these slum-like conditions, what were called alleys in Washington. And she was very concerned about that. And I think Nellie Taft had noticed some of that as well. But Ellen took a very strong effort to get people involved, to go and visit. She even put the White House car out there for people to visit. A lot of people around her. The National Civic Federation was a group of well-meaning people who she was very connected with. And by the way, she was also the first lady, like Eleanor, to earn her own money. She was an artist, a very successful one as well. But of course, all of this is leading up to Florence, who made the cracks in the mold, as you have heard, that Eleanor broke. And I know our time is short, so many of you know that Eleanor was all the wonderful things, of course, that we're hearing about from Anita. But she was also, on top of that, a very unusual activist, a champion, someone who spoke out on very difficult issues at a time when her husband really wished that she would not have. And yeah, I mean, this was a problem, and not only him, but the people around him. And one of the issues, of course, that she spoke out on was race relations, right? And this was, you probably know the story of how Marian Anderson was going to sing at the Constitution Hall that was run by the Daughters of the American Revolution, but they said, oh, no, we can't have her. So then Eleanor said, well, I will have this lovely African-American singer come to the contralto, right? Come and sing at Lincoln Memorial. But she went well beyond that. She spoke up for African-Americans in World War II who were being denied jobs that were of interest. For instance, they were all relegated to positions as messmen. And she said, no, these are trained people. They want to do something else. And to her credit, the Army did pick up on that. The Navy, not so much for a long time, sadly. I don't know about that. And then on the really, really difficult issue, the really heartbreaking issue of lynching, she spoke out about that at a time when her husband really wished this would not be mentioned because Southern congressmen were getting outraged on this being brought up. But she spoke out on it. And once he had died, she was able to speak more effectively. Of course, she got involved in the United Nations. She was very involved in the human rights activism there. So she was able to carry her activism further once he died, sadly. But this was, she didn't give up. She never stopped. Eleanor was a pretty amazing woman.
And this activism also extends to culture and art. And obviously, Jacqueline Kennedy, we can't mention activism in that regard without citing her name and her influence on the White House Historical Association, for example.
Yeah, when Mrs. Kennedy arrived in 1961, she was very interested in the House being more than just a government residence. She wanted it was already a place people went out of curiosity, but did they go in order to learn? Did they go in order to see the taste of the people that had lived there before and to see the portraits of the presidents and first ladies and learn more about how important a facility and a symbol it is to the American people? And so she worked out the founding of the White House Historical Association with its principal goal at that point being to publish a guidebook. Right. And they came out with a guidebook, which is now in its, 42nd edition. And it was designed because she was going to then say, I want formal tours of the White House. I want to talk to the Park Service. We're going to figure out a way to get the public in on a regular basis. And so instead of being kind of an ad hoc thing where you got to pass from your congressman or whatever to come to the White House, there was going to be strict formal tours. And it then became the only residence of a chief of state in the world open to the public on a regular free basis. And the public thronged to this idea. And then she, in order to make the house interesting to people, she said, well, let's collect things. And let's add to the old stuff that survived the sales and the fire of 1814 and such, and let's fill the rooms with the most beautiful things we can find that were made in America or by American artists or appropriate for an American home. That's where we've been going on. Create the curator's office with the idea that, well, if you're going to have a collection, you need somebody to acquire it and interpret it and preserve it and conserve it. So we've been working ever since, adding to the collection, getting back some of the things that got away from the auctions and the garage sales of the past. You know, when they come up, that's one of our favorite things, is to find those. But Mrs. Kennedy was an immense force that then allowed each of the subsequent first ladies to, you know, have a role in adding to the collection, whether it be fine art or decorative arts, and add to the decor of the rooms. We're not freezing rooms in time. There are many people who think, oh, nothing's changed since Jackie Kennedy. But that's the furthest thing from her mind would ever have been to presume that the next First Lady didn't have her own opinion and her own opportunity to add to the history of the house. And so she was an important force, and each First Lady has done wonderfully well and enjoyed, and the curator's office has had a great time working with all of them since.
And before we close our conversation, I want to go back to the example of Mrs. Bush and her work in Afghanistan, which is work we continue here at the Bush Institute through our Women's Initiative. And Anita, just to close us out, I would love for you to speak to the significance of that.
Well, I think Mrs. Bush, when she spoke out in November of 2001 and first lady to deliver a presidential radio address, and she spoke about the plight of Afghan women and what they were facing as the world's eyes now were open to the brutality of the regime that they lived under. And she spoke out for them. And to this day continues to speak out for them. And over this period of time, we've watched such incredible progress that they have been able to make. You know, her historic trip to Afghanistan in 2005 to preside over the Memorandum of Understanding for this, of a new American University of Afghanistan, and also with the Minister of Education on efforts that our government was, through the generosity of the American people, wanted to rebuild the education system in that country, the health system, particularly for women, women's empowerment across all levels. They had been denied in education now for a generation. And as Mrs. Bush often said, you can decimate a country in a day, but to rebuild it takes a very, very long time. And this sustained commitment and the voice that she has been for Afghan women, and in partnership now with Mrs. Ghani, the First Lady of Afghanistan, also Mrs. Clinton, who's also on the U.S. Afghan Women's Council, the Afghan women know it. They know what a champion she has been, that Laura Bush has been for them. And in fact, I didn't even have a chance to tell Mrs. Bush this yet, but our new U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, John Bass, wrote me just recently and said he just cut the ribbon on a second dormitory at the American University of Afghanistan, where 200 women will live. 180 are there right now, and they are the promise and the future of their country. And he has saved a piece of that ribbon for you, Mrs. Bush, and he's sending that to you. So we'll have that for you, so that you can be, as he said, that you can be reminded for all that you did to change the lives of women and girls in that country. So through the work of the Bush Institute, you're able to stay engaged, and through the women's leadership programs that you run, they just know she'll be with them forever. And in fact, one of her final interviews out of the White House, she said that, I will stand with Afghan women for the rest of my life, and she has.
Incredible. Well, we have so many First Ladies and so little time, but I have to say, As a final thought, I hope all of you have come to appreciate this role without a rule book and the incredible influence our First Ladies have had on our country's history and really on the history of the world. And I hope you'll come see us in our new exhibit. I also want to add that the conversation does not stop here. We are launching our new podcast, the first Bush Institute podcast series, Ladies First, and a number of our panelists have already participated in interviews. So I encourage you to sign up for that. And I thank you all for being here. I thank all our panelists for helping us launch our new exhibit.
It was fun. Thanks.
Thank you all so much. I'm Ken Hirsch, the CEO of the Bush Center here, and I want to thank our wonderful panelists. This is a great example of our ability to bring once in a lifetime, very unique opportunity content that intersects our policy work and something that the public will enjoy. I want to thank Natalie, Anita, Catherine, and Lee and Bill. Your expertise and your insight is so unique, and to have you all on one stage talking from your individual perspectives is a real treat. I also want to thank again Highland Capital Management, who has helped endow the program here, our Engage program, so that we can bring great content to you all. We have books available. We have Catherine and Lee's and Mrs. Bush's book available in the lobby. If you didn't get a chance to see the exhibit, it's open until October 1st. Stay tuned for our announcement on our next Engage events for the spring, which will be coming out soon. However, the next event will be on April the 20th, and it's a conversation with Jeff Bezos at Moody Coliseum. It is sold out, but it will be live streamed on bushcenter.org at 6:30 p.m. So if you want to watch that, please tune in. And thank you all. If you're not already a member, please join, and we'll see you at the next event. Thank you.